everyone. Thank you so much for being here. What an amazing audience. It's a real pleasure to be here in Berlin. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to speak a little bit today about the book and focus in particular on the climate crisis and the Green New Deal. So I guess we've heard now from a couple of different speakers about this idea that the moment that we're in right now is an historic one. Whatever way you look at it, if you look at the economies of the rich world, productivity is stagnant in many of them. It's certainly slowing. Wage growth in many parts of the world, the rich world, is also slowing. Rates of investment are slowing. Inequality between places and within places is rising. There's a general sense that the economy isn't working the way it should. When you look at the level of the global economy, we've got a global debt bubble 3 times the size of global GDP. We have kind of rising inequality within and between countries, a kind of the slowdown in globalization, and a rise in protectionism. And a bunch of other kind of isolated problems within financial systems, within the economies, not just in the global north, but also in many parts of the global south. And then you add into that the fact that we are facing the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced, the existential crisis of climate breakdown. And all of this put together makes it feel like we're in a bit of a kind of a historical moment, a bit of a crisis moment. And for those of us who situate ourselves in the tradition of Marxism, this is not surprising because capitalism as a political and economic system tends towards crisis. It generates crisis very frequently. And this one is no different. It is a crisis that has emerged from the logic of the system of capitalism, that is private ownership of the means of production, the stuff we need to produce things, the exploitation of our resources for profit over all other social and environmental goals, and the enforcement of that logic by the capitalist state. And when you start looking at this crisis in those terms, which is not ones that the kind of mainstream economists are traditionally telling us to use, then we can situate this moment in kind of a long history of capitalist development over the last century. And this is what my book tries to do. There are lots of stories about like how this crisis has emerged, what's gone on, and what we need to do about it. But the story I tell in Stolen is a story of class and of class politics and of the kind of the essential divide created by capitalism, the essential class divide, which is that between labour and capital, what I call the divide between people who live off work and people who live off wealth. And the inherent contradiction and conflict between these two groups generates various political and economic contradictions that ultimately lead to the kinds of crisis that we're seeing today. And the story of the last 40 years is really a story of the victory of capital, people who live off wealth, over labour, and the victory in particular of a section of capital, financial capital, and its growing dominance over all other areas of the economy. So in Stolen, I situate this moment, this crisis, as the crisis of not just a particular not just kind of banking crisis, not just like a hangover from 2008, but actually the breakdown of an entire way of organising the economy, particularly prevalent in the US, the UK, various other financialised economies, but actually linked in with a global system of what I call kind of finance-led growth that has come to predominate in various different parts of the world, and which is integral to not just the economic crisis, not just the political crisis we're facing at the moment, but also climate breakdown. And the argument in the book is that if this crisis results from the nature of capitalism and that conflict between different classes, then the only way to get out of it is to mount a class project from below. Bernie Sanders has a brilliant quote, which I absolutely love. I think it's one of the best quotes we've had from a politician this century, which is, if there's been class war for a long time in this country, it's about time the working classes won it. I think that pretty much sums up the argument in my book, is that, fighting back against climate breakdown, against political chaos, economic breakdown, requires building a class project from below. It requires uniting everyone around the world within our countries who lives off work in an alliance against people who live off wealth and who are sacrificing our environment, our societies for the sake of short-term profit. Now, I kind of came to writing about this because, I worked at a think tank in the UK called the Institute of Public Policy Research, and we were doing some analysis of the kind of big problems with the British economy. And there are a lot of problems. So we've had a decade of wage stagnation, a decade of productivity stagnation, slowing investment, rising poverty, rising insecurity, the growth of in-work poverty, and a kind of big debt problem in the private sector in particular. And looking at that from the kind of traditional economic perspective, there were a variety of potential explanations. There was this idea that we were just living through this age of secular stagnation, where economies in the rich world just have to accustom themselves to lower rates of growth than they did in the past. Economists have come up with various different arguments as to why that might be: demographic aging, a slowdown in the rate of technological change, the particular dynamics that were created by the financial crisis, etc. What none of them really bother to look at is class. And it's not that surprising that they don't bother to look at class, because really, since the 1980s, since the Berlin Wall fell, we have been told a story about how capitalism works. And the story was, in 1989, history ended. Capitalism won. That decades-long battle between ideas and the movements that championed them, that had characterized the 20th century, that battle between capitalism and socialism, between bosses and the workers, that was over, we were told. There was no other alternative to this particular model of capitalism, and things would continue to get better. Things would only get better, in the words of Tony Blair in the UK. And there was, this assumption that growth would continue indefinitely, house prices would continue to rise forever, debt could continue growing forever, and that the global south would, if it just implemented the right policies, catch up with the global north. 2008 was when this promise died. And with it, class politics kind of came back with a bang, because the assumptions that this ideology was based on, this kind of, what the ideology that Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, which is that, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, was that class didn't matter anymore, right? Because these really clever economists had figured out ways of understanding, modelling and managing the economy that meant that, we could just devolve policy making to them, and they would pull the right levers, adjust tax rates, adjust regulation in just the right way, so as to make everyone better off, so as to maximise everyone's utility. We didn't have to think about where the rewards were going, as long as a rising tide was lifting all boats, as long as the economy was growing, GDP was going up, we could assume that everyone was getting better off. Now, today we know that the kind of arrogance of economists in assuming that they had answered all of these questions was based on a number of different mistakes. So first and most obviously, a failure to adequately understand the dynamics of the financial system. Secondly, a failure to incorporate an understanding of debt in their models of the economy. But also a failure to look at distribution, to see where the growth was coming from and who it was going to. Since the financial crisis, since we realised that actually those neutral technocratic economic experts have no idea what they were talking about, and were asleep at the wheel when it came to the financial crisis, there's suddenly been a rebirth of class politics. Both, in the level of kind of electoral politics more generally, and also an understanding amongst economists, amongst political scientists, that class does matter again. And this is kind of, I suppose, integral, not just to kind of the moment that we're facing today, but to the story of the last kind of 100 years. And this is the story that I tell in Stolen. And it's basically one that sees the development of capitalism through a series of stages. So kind of institutional eras marked by different balances of power between those two major classes. And when you look at the kind of development of capitalism in that way, you start to notice some patterns. And the big pattern you notice is moments, kind of eras of stability that last a couple of decades, maybe 20, 30 years, characterized by the creation of new sets of institutions, the dissemination of new discourses, new ways of understanding the world, but which contain their own contradictions and ultimately lead to crises. And following those periods of stability, you end up in a moment of crisis. And looking back over, since kind of 1900, since before that, you have in the 1890s, out of the crisis that emerged in that decade, the rise of kind of the idea of a laissez-faire, of let the economy be. And this was associated with a new wave of globalization, massive increases in inequality, particularly in the UK and the US and various other parts of Europe, and the kind of development of capitalism, of the growth of stock markets, particularly in the US, of housing markets, and ultimately the Great Depression. The Great Depression then sets off a decade and a half of crisis, which ends obviously in the Second World War. Out of the Second World War emerges a new institutional structure. And this new institutional structure is based on a different balance of power between those two forces in society, between labour and capital, people who live off work and people who live off wealth. Because the states that come out of the Second World War are much stronger than those that had entered it. They are bigger, they have much higher tax bases, they are much more involved in the operation of the economy. They've often nationalised large sections of industry. The union movement is much more powerful because it has this strategic role in production and in the war economy, and you get close to full employment. And the labour movement is also increasingly represented electorally in political parties in most parts of the global north. At the same time, you have the emergence of the Bretton Woods system, which is a system of currency pegging that pegs various different currencies all around the world to the dollar and the dollar to gold. And associated with that is a system of restrictions on capital mobility. So limits on the ability of money to move all around the world, accompanied by quite rigid control over the finance sector. So you can see in all these different ways, the power of capital, people who live off wealth, is constrained, and the power of workers is boosted. And the governments that are elected after the Second World War reflect that. They tend to represent the interests of organised labour much more than they had in the past. And as a result, we get the emergence of a kind of new institutional framework under the guise of Keynesianism, which provides the ecological and theoretical underpinnings to this new model of what comes to be known as social democracy. So in the UK, the US, again, various other parts of Europe, you have the emergence of welfare states. Well, at least the kind of the consolidation of welfare states. You have states that is much more willing to intervene in the economy. You have stronger union movements. You have much higher levels of nationalisation. And you have an assumption or a kind of tacit bargain between labour and capital, those two classes, mediated by the states, whereby that conflict is not resolved, but it's muted by mechanisms to ensure that labour is getting a bit more and that capital is willing to compromise on the returns from growth that are going to these two sections of the economy. And that model, social democracy, the post-war consensus, Keynesianism, whatever you want to call it, lasts for about almost 30 years. And it kind of supervises what comes to be known as the golden age of capitalism. So you have high rates of growth, low rates of inflation, high employment, increasing wages, and some convergence between global north and global south. Of course, this also being the end of being premised upon the continuation and then the end of imperial relations between global north and global south. So that, seems to be a kind of fairly stable institutional structure. But then comes the 1970s. And what you start to see throughout this period is actually that it's less stable than it looks because it contains some of its own contradictions. And those contradictions arise from the fact that you still have that conflict between those two classes. It's impossible to imagine a capitalist economy in which there isn't conflict between labour and capital, in which there isn't some form of contradiction that emerges from the class nature of capitalism as a system of production. And this is just as true of social democracy as it is of any other way of organising the economy. And in the 1970s, that conflict, which had been kind of pushed under the surface, exploded. And the reason it did that was that it's easy to be able to kind of create and manage this compromise between labour and capital when a lot is being produced, when the economy's going well, you've got globalisation, you've got high levels of productivity, but that starts to slow in the 1970s. You get the first oil price spike, which sends inflation through the roof. At the point that inflation goes through the roof, capitalists start thinking we need to cut costs, workers start thinking we need wage rises increasing with inflation. And so that leads to a significant increase in kind of industrial conflict. And suddenly you get, bam, class politics, back again, labour versus capital, bosses versus workers. At the same time, over the course of this period, capital, and particularly finance capital, has been figuring out ways to kind of get around the system of constraints imposed upon it through Bretton Woods. So you have the emergence of the offshore Eurodollar markets, which are this kind of unregulated market in dollars outside of the US. You have the rise of the big multinational corporation, which again undermines those capital controls because so much money flows around within these corporations. And you have a set of changes that make it much harder to maintain capital controls. So at the same time as social democracy is breaking down domestically, you have the erosion of this Bretton Woods system that constrained the power of finance internationally. And then in the 1970s, these two things come together and you get this decade of crisis. Again, social democracy, Keynesianism has run up against its own contradictions, and it's resulted in this big crisis and this decade of turmoil where you get industrial disputes, you get economic breakdown, you get political turmoil. And out of this crisis, this moment of contingency, I suppose, this moment of kind of institutional breakdown, we get the emergence of a very new model. And you can see how towards the end of this period, finance capital has kind of regenerated some of its power, and organised labour is looking perhaps a little bit weaker than it had before. So again, the balance of power has shifted, and this helps to determine what happens next. Because again, towards the end of the 1970s, you get in the UK and the US, the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And these two politicians are very consciously operating in the interests of one section of capital, of international financial capital, and promoting this ideology of neoliberalism that those capitalists have been very integral in kind of generating. And their view is that the only way to solve this crisis of the 1970s is to unleash the power of the free market. And particularly by unleashing the power of the finance sector. And this is really when you start to see the institutionalization of this new way of organising the economy, this new model of growth, which I call finance-led growth. So Thatcher and Reagan come to power, they deregulate the banks, they deregulate stock markets, they privatise a bunch of state industries, they cut taxes, they cut regulation, and they go to war with their country's unions, impose all sorts of anti-union legislation. And in the UK in particular, there is a year-long outright fight between the government and striking miners. And looking back on this, at the time it would have been difficult to see this, but looking back on this, and when you look at the historical record of what these people thought they were doing, it's very clear that this was an attempt to decimate the balance of power between labour and capital that had underpinned social democracy. It was an attempt to use the power of the state to rebalance power in society away from people who live off work and towards people who live off wealth. And in particular, to rebalance power towards the banks and those who manage and control investment. And this is what led to the rise of finance-led growth. So you start to see the growth of, you get the growth of the finance sector itself, so a massive increase in bank lending. You start to see the emergence of these big international asset managers, and these are really important. These are kind of, the BlackRocks of this world that manage big pots of money and therefore direct investment in the economy. And when we think about finance, you can really think about two main actors there. Bankers, which kind of create money and then generate credit and kind of direct investment in that way. And then there's money managers who accumulate pools of savings from our pensions, from the profits of corporations, from the savings of the wealthy, and then invest that in different areas of the economy. So kind of creditors and money managers start to play a much more significant role in the economies of countries all around the world. At the same time, Bretton Woods collapsed at the beginning of the 1970s, as I say, and with the rise of neoliberalism, you see the final removal of those restrictions on capital mobility, which means money is now free to flow around the world at will. And again, this is a significant shift of power in favour of international finance. So suddenly you have, these increasing, a much greater role being played by private financial actors, whether they're banks, whether they're investors, in determining who gets what in the economy, determining where money goes, where investment goes, where credit is directed. And a significant result of that is financialisation in various different parts of the economy. So it's not just that these big institutions grow and become bigger and more powerful, it's they start changing the way the rest of the economy works. So in the book, I talk about the financialisation of the corporation, of the household, and of the state. And the financialisation of the corporation is basically premised upon the growing power of these big pools of money, these big money managers, in determining what goes on in big corporations. And their role is to basically enforce this ideology of shareholder value. So the idea that the only responsibility of a corporation is to maximize value for shareholders. And you start to see the emergence of kind of activist investors who pressure companies to distribute more to shareholders, corporate raiders who will take out cheap debt, go and buy up corporations, strip out the assets and sell off their assets and distribute the funds to shareholders. And kind of throughout the 80s, you get the real kind of rigid enforcement of shareholder value ideology. And ultimately, there are kind of three ways that corporations start to maximize value for shareholders. So firstly, they cut wages and they cut investment. So you start to see a kind of long-term fall in wage growth that starts in the 1980s. They also cut investment in creating stuff, in fixed capital, so in technology, in building new factories, whatever. And they start to change the way that they use their returns. So rather than investing them, rather than distributing them to workers, they distribute them to shareholders, either by increasing dividends, by buying back their own shares, or by merging with or acquiring other corporations. And this is again when you start to see these huge waves of M&A that generate these massive multinational corporations that have become so dominant in our lifetimes. So the kind of financialization of the corporation leads to this big internal redistribution within the firm from workers to shareholders and to creditors. And at the same time as this is happening, many firms also start to load up on debt in order to pay out this money to shareholders, which makes that corporate model really unsustainable. So this is kind of almost going back to like the 1920s model of capitalism, right? It's one which is pretty extractive, based on the creation of quite a lot of debt, creates quite a lot of inequality. But the kind of genius of the financialization fix is that rather than kind of leaving this unequal financialized corporate model to wreak havoc on society and to continuously repress wages, therefore accelerating many of the problems that took place in the 1920s, i.e., wages falling, investment falling, and therefore demand falling, and that creating kind of problems within the real economy. Financialization is based on this logic of privatized Keynesianism, which is that rather than the state stepping in to provide investment to kind of pick up the economy when it starts to fall, you get the creation of huge amounts of private debt to make up that shortfall. So wages are falling, or at least wage growth isn't increasing as fast as it once did, but because these politicians have deregulated the banking system, much of that is made up for by an increase in household debt, a massive increase in household debt in some parts of the world. And a lot of that debt is used to purchase housing. And this, again, comprises another part of the politics of this model, which is that if people like Thatcher and Reagan can create a nation of property owners, then they can create an economic and political model that's stable, because those people that own their homes, that have equity stored up in their homes, also that own their own pension funds, have an incentive to support the stability of the system because they're accruing wealth as a result of it, even if their wages aren't increasing as fast as they once were. So you get the financialization of the household, which is the replacement of wage increases with the accumulation of debt, and the increasing reliance on private asset ownership, whether that is owning your own house or owning your own pension fund, rather than socialized forms of insurance, whether that be public pensions or public housing. And this ultimately is what generates the dynamics that lead into the financial crisis, because there is a continuous incentive to expand home ownership. That means more and more debt has to be created. That means the banks have to be continuously deregulated so that they can create more credit. It means that economies have to be opened up so that capital can be sucked in to these economies that are generating all this money. And a lot of that money comes from places like Germany, right, which has a big, which exports capital to the rest of the world, whereas those really highly indebted financialized economies import that capital and turn it into debt. So the financialization of the household is ultimately what leads up to the financial crisis. At the same time, where's the state in all this, right? The state should have been ideally kind of regulating the financial system to prevent the emergence of all these vulnerabilities. But instead, it itself has become financialized. You start to see, independence for many economic policy makers. So independence for central banks, right? Which effectively means the insulation of these decision makers from democratic accountability and their increasing capture by financial markets. And you see this in the UK with the increasing links between the Bank of England and the City of London, or the Fed and Wall Street in the US. In Europe, the ECB and various different financial actors. And as a result, they fail to regulate the financial system properly. In fact, they actively deregulate it because they think, well, we need more debt. And this is the goose that lays the golden eggs. So we can tax the City of London, and that will generate the returns that we need as a government to do the things that we want to do. At the same time, the new Labour government in the UK takes this even one step further by launching the private financing initiatives, by saying rather than kind of borrowing in order to invest ourselves, we will get private investors to borrow on capital markets and undertake spending on our behalf, even though that's way more expensive than just state borrowing in and of itself. And so this idea of the replacement of privatized Keynesianism, of private debt, with public borrowing and public debt is a really central part of the logic of financialization. And that's what links it into austerity. And this is obviously a very familiar argument to be making in the German case. Germany today, investors will pay the German government to hold its debt, right? And yet there is still this ongoing and really seriously ideological commitment not to have, to maintain a budget surplus, right? And again, this is very strongly linked to the logic of financialization, which is that private investors, money managers, those kind of big institutional investors that become so important, hold our debt. And it is up to us as a state to demonstrate that we are creditworthy and therefore deserve to have these private investors hold our debt. So the increasing kind of interrelationships between private governments and those big institutional investors, again, becomes really, really important in enforcing the logic of austerity and in enforcing this idea that the state should step back and allow private actors to undertake as much economic activity as conceivably possible. And you start to see the encroachment of the market into areas where it's never existed before. In the UK, you get the privatization, the marketization of housing in particular, but also of various other kind of like services and the means of subsistence, the things we need to survive are increasingly commodified and marketized and ultimately financialized. So through this process, through the financialization of the corporation, of the household and of the state, you start to see the emergence of this new economic model where the role of creditors, of bankers, and of money managers is increasingly central in the decision-making of corporations, of households, of the state, and of the way the economy works as a whole. But ultimately, of course, this model is rendered politically stable by the creation of huge amounts of debt, the proliferation of home ownership, and that is the source of its contradictions, because in 2008 it collapses. And suddenly, this whole idea that history was over, capitalism had won, ceases to make sense anymore. People start thinking, wow, if it used to not be possible to be able to imagine the end of capitalism, then today, we are seeing not just the end of capitalism, but potentially like the end of the world as we know it. And the financial crisis takes place alongside the acceleration of climate breakdown. So we get these dual crises that suddenly start to make it look like capitalism, and in particular finance-led growth, are increasingly unsustainable. And there are very clear ways in which financialisation has exacerbated climate breakdown and the climate crisis, because, and again, this comes down to these, the way in which banks and money managers direct credit in the economy. Because absent any kind of public accountability, any democratic accountability as to where our collective savings, where credit creation is directed towards, the activities, the industries that kind of get most of this investment and get most of this credit do not tend to be green. And today we continue to have this problem of big banks, big asset managers who control our pensions, investing very heavily in fossil fuels companies, right? So 2008, the model breaks down, and suddenly, it seems as though capitalism is under question again. And since then, we've had all these sorts of morbid symptoms emerge. So, as I said, we've had this decade of productivity stagnation, decade of wage stagnation, mounting environmental catastrophe, and a whole host of other really quite deep-seated problems, which suggest that not just finance-led growth is an adaptation of capitalism, but capitalism as a whole is running out of road. And the climate crisis really adds to this, because it is hard to see how it is possible to deal with climate breakdown under a system that prioritizes the pursuit of profit over all other social and environmental goals. As long as you have the profit motive centered in corporate decision making, as long as you have corporations being run solely in the interests of shareholders and creditors, it becomes very difficult to imagine how, even if you try and regulate them, even if you try and tax carbon, they don't find ways around this to maximize their profits, without regard for the environment and for society as a whole. So we're in this moment where capitalism seems vulnerable, right? It seems weaker. It seems unable to provide the hope for the future that has always historically been the basis of support for this system. This idea that things could only get better has started to break down. And that's what creates very dangerous conditions, right? Because, in the midst of the financial crisis, it was easy to believe things are really, really bad right now, but they'll go back to normal in a couple of years. But after a decade of things failing to go back to normal, and in fact, things getting a lot worse on a whole bunch of different fronts, people start to think, maybe I have more to gain from actually challenging this system than I do from trying to continue to support it. And this is one of the main reasons that we've seen the rise of, this millennial socialism idea, right? It's not that we young people are kind of naive and don't remember the USSR. It's that, there are, it's increasingly difficult to see how many people, millennials, Gen Z, etc., how they will ever expect to own any capital. Why would you support capitalism if you will never expect to own any capital? Most people who were kind of promised that they would one day own their own homes, that they would have big pension pots, they would be able to use their retirement, that no longer looks like it's going to be possible. And at the same time as, people can't expect to own these things anymore, the state has shrunk. So not only can you not own your own home, you probably can't rent it off the state either. You have to rent it from a private landlord who is extracting more and more money from you. Corporations are hugely financialized, wages are stagnated, they're not investing in the future, they're not creating jobs, they're just speculating, and they're not paying their workers very much. A decade of wage stagnation, which has primarily hit young people who've lost that really important part of their careers where they should have been seeing wage growth and should have been able to save some money. A state that is increasingly aloof and more responsive to the interests of the finance sector than it is to us, to the people. And all of this kind of underpins this revival in an understanding of class, right? Because it's very easy to see who's benefited from the last 40 years of finance-led growth. It's been the top 1%. And for a while we let this go because it seemed like, the debt creation could go on forever. And because the debt creation could go on forever, then we could carry on getting better off forever, even if the 1% were kind of monopolizing most of the gains from growth. That would eventually trickle down to everyone else. Now that lie has been completely exposed. And the response has been an understanding that actually the financial crisis, austerity, quantitative easing, climate breakdown, they all seem to be governed by the same logic, which is that the wealthy get most of the gains, the wealthy cause most of the problems, and yet it's the vast majority of people, labour, the workers, people who live off work rather than people who live off wealth, who have to bear the costs of this, who have to pick up the pieces when this economy, this system breaks down. If you look at the bank bailouts, they were, it was a massive kind of intervention on the part of the state to shore up the incomes of some of the wealthiest people in society. Who bore the cost of it? It was working people through austerity. If you look at quantitative easing, this has been the creation of trillions of dollars of new money all around the world. What has it done? It's boosted house prices, it's boosted stock markets, it's made the wealthy wealthier and left everyone else unable to buy their own houses. Look at climate breakdown. The top 10% of people in the global economy are responsible for 50% of all emissions. Most fossil fuel companies knew about climate change in the 1960s, and yet they've made billions from continuing to exploit our natural resources at an unsustainable rate and pumped much of that money into climate denialism. A pattern starts to emerge, and you start to see, the period of kind of, that end of history moment between 1989 and 2008, that benefited the wealthy, disbenefited everyone else, and ultimately led to a financial crisis that ordinary working people were forced to bear the cost of. And this is leading to the emergence of a very different kind of politics. And it's the politics that we're starting to see under Corbyn in the UK, under Sanders in the US, in certain other parts of the world, of actually saying it's not enough just to elect clever politicians, tell them to go in there and fix capitalism, tell them to kind of regulate industry a bit more, tell them to, give the capitalists a bit of a slap on the wrist if they do something wrong, to try and deal with climate change by, taxing people in the right way or regulating people in the right way, to try and deal with inequality by, taxing and redistributing stuff. And it becomes increasingly obvious that unless we have a political system that is run in the interest of the majority, then the majority are going to keep on getting fucked over by the wealthy. So millennial socialism, the rebirth of democratic socialism, is a response to the historical moment that we find ourselves in today, which is a deep-seated crisis, not just of finance-led growth, but of capitalism as a whole. And it's become increasingly clear that the only way to deliver ourselves from this crisis is to build a class project from below that's able to push back and actually start to challenge the logic of capitalism, the logic of a system that sees a small number of people own all the stuff, and those same people make all the rules. And for that system to be replaced by one in which we collectively own all the stuff and we collectively make all the rules. That is the basis of the argument for democratic socialism. So how do we get there? Looking back to the last time we were in this kind of crisis was the 1970s, and you had a very clear and coherent class project centered around this, group of neoliberals, Thatchers, Reagans, these think tanks that emerged during that time, that they were going to use the state to shift power in society. And I think that we need to be, socialists need to be looking at the role that they can play at this particular historical juncture in the same way. It's not the role of socialists to go into government and say, let's fix capitalism, let's make it less bad. The role of socialists in government is to rebalance power in society away from people who live off wealth and towards people who live off work. To go into the state, and the phrase that I use is to take on the banks the way that Thatcher took on the unions. And this requires a very different mode of political organisation, as well as a different mode of governing, because it requires the emergence of a very powerful grassroots movement. Politicians left to their own devices are not going to go in and shake up a system that in one way or another probably benefits them. The only way that we get this new kind of class politics is if we build a class project from below. And that is why it's so exciting to see, not just Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party in the UK, but the fact that the Labour Party now has 500,000 members and is the biggest party in Western Europe, that we're seeing the emergence of momentum, that we're seeing to an extent, the revival of some labour organising, that we're starting to see people actually organise in the streets to tackle climate change. So the way out really involves the kind of deepening and broadening of this class project and the articulation of a certain set of demands. And I'm not going to go into all of these in too much detail. You can read the book if you want to know exactly how to solve every problem in the world. But the two kind of categories that these demands fall into, one of which is kind of constraining the power of private finance, and the other of which is boosting the power of workers. And so constraining the power of finance means, properly regulating the banks. It means controlling credit creation. It means controlling capital flows. It means setting up new public banking systems that are able to direct credit, not just into speculation over housing, not into fossil fuel companies, but actually into green, sustainable investment in the future of the economy. And under that mantle, it also requires, the development of a Green New Deal that is based on the logic of investment in order to grow the economy and change the way it works. An economy that refuses to invest is one which basically says the way that everything works now is the way that we always hope that it will work. Unless a government and a people can actually say, this is our plan, this is what we want to change, and this is how we are investing to transform the way the economy is going to work over the long term, then things will remain largely as they are. You've seen this throughout history, that when a government sets up a set of missions, a set of priorities, whether that's fighting a war, going to the moon, building the internet, that shapes history in ways that initially would have been very difficult to predict. It's the same thing with decarbonisation. At the moment, it seems like an almost impossible task, but if we can put not just our kind of collective class power, but the power manifested in these states as well, towards a program of investment that decarbonises the economy, that greens our energy generation, that develops public transport, that invests in research and development into green technologies, whilst also ensuring that the gains from that investment don't just accrue to a small elite, but actually are kind of shared by society as a whole. That's really the foundation of this idea of the Green New Deal, and it is essential to dealing with this climate crisis, and it's also completely inimical to the logic of capitalism, which is that governments don't invest, the private sector invests. You don't have public banks, you have private banks that are run for profit, not social good. But you don't, have the state stepping in to alleviate, to provide jobs in, new green industries. You have to allow the market to create unemployment so that people are scared enough that they don't organise in order to demand higher wages. So all of this starts to look like a really significant challenge to the logic of capitalism. But ultimately, it doesn't get us to a solution. And, remember that the conflict and the contradictions, the problems created by capitalism are always conflicts and contradictions generated by class tensions, like class conflict between people who live off work and those who live off wealth, is to actually remove that distinction entirely by socializing ownership, by having nationalized corporations, democratically owned public services, worker-owned corporations, cooperatively owned corporations, structures of ownership that are not based on, the monopolization of wealth by a small number of people at the top, and democratic decision-making in all of those sets of institutions. So not just a kind of state socialism of the 1970s, but actually a set of institutions that are democratically owned and accountable to ordinary working people who can then set our collective priorities and determine how our resources are used. And when you put all of that together, when you put it together with the stuff that we're all talking about alongside that, so a 4-day week, the kind of decommodification of the means of subsistence, so having everything that you need to survive free or very cheap at the point of use, removing obstacles to worker organising, a whole bunch of other stuff that the left is talking about at the moment, you start to see that the contours of quite a significant plan are emerging, and that all the intellectual energy is really on the left. The right has absolutely no answers to any of these massive problems that we are currently facing. But the difference between having a plan and building socialism, building power, is having a movement. And that's really where I think, as much as ideas separate them, I think that's what really separates the left and democratic socialists from traditional social democratic parties, is the sense that the government, that politicians aren't going to do this for us. It's up to us to build a movement from the grassroots up, and to actually, get involved in political parties, get out on the streets and demand a solution to climate change, organise in our workplaces, organise in our communities, talk to our friends, neighbours, colleagues, co-workers and say, hey, have you heard about this thing? And start to actually not just say to our politicians, go and do this, but actively shift power in society away from the people who currently monopolise it and towards the vast majority. And that's what I hope we're going to see over the coming weeks when I think a Corbyn government will be elected on the 12th of December, which it will. And especially that's why it's important not just to get out to vote, but actually, talk to everyone about what's going on. And this could be our kind of 1979 moment, right? The final year in a decade of crisis that leads to the development of an entirely new way of organising the economy, way of organising society, and hopefully one that ultimately also solves climate breakdown and allows us to deliver a world that works in the interests of the many, not the few. Thanks.
Use this one?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Sit down.
Okay.
So we'll take questions. What we aren't looking for is a second speaker. We've had one. Really, questions, not statements. You have to raise your hand well because the lighting is so that we can hardly see you. So, do you have any questions?
There's some there.
There.
Sure. My question's about, I wanted to know what your view is of sort of resurgent nationalist parties, so particularly in Poland and France, that would seem to be doing sort of the second part of what the first part of what you were suggesting as a kind of correction of financialisation, which is to sort of rein in capital, right? But are kind of raising, minimum wage domestically, and offering sort of domestic electorates a sort of one aspect of this sort of solution, and how you might kind of combat that on a European level or a sort of democratic socialist level.
Yeah, I mean, this is really important because moments of crisis and moments of breakdown obviously don't inevitably benefit the left. And in many ways, the kind of crisis moment that we're seeing today is much more similar to the 1930s than it is the 1970s, because, we're living in the moment after a huge financial crisis, and without a powerful left voice that obviously didn't really exist in many parts of the world in 2007, it was easy for people to blame that crisis and the stagnation that followed on predictable groups. Like you see, part of the massive increase that we've seen in anti-Semitism since 2007 and 8 is the prevalence of this narrative that, it's like the Rothschilds that rule the world and they caused the financial crisis, right? At the same time, it was easy to blame austerity and collapsing living standards in the UK on migrants, on Muslims. The same thing can be said of many parts of Europe, where obviously you've had layers of suffering and deprivation heaped on top of one another, with the financial crisis being followed by the sovereign debt crisis and the institutionalization of deflation in many of these economies. And the ease with which the far right was able to lean on the worst side of human nature and just say, don't really think about what's going on, don't try and analyze the dynamics that are driving this, just look around, find someone that looks a bit different to you and say it's their fault. Combined with the resurgence of nationalism and protectionism, and an increased reliance on the nation state to basically protect people against globalization, has proven a pretty toxic mix. And I think part of the reason for that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the whole reason for that is, and this is borne out by study after study after study, is that when you don't have a strong left voice that is able to articulate people's concerns in class terms, they will inevitably fall into this, xenophobic, nationalistic division in society. Because, when bad stuff happens, people need someone to blame, right? And generally there is someone to blame. It's just that because this language of class politics is so unfamiliar to us after 30 years of being told that it doesn't matter, it's much easier to slip into, a kind of xenophobic, like racist discourse that locates the blame for these problems with people who are ultimately just as powerless as the ones that are doing the blaming, rather than actually saying, where is this coming from? Ultimately, we are living in a system that is created by, generated by an elite that disproportionately benefits from it, and which is going to continue to heap the costs of adjustment and stagnation on working people if we don't completely replace that system. So the toxic mix of like right-wing xenophobic nationalistic discourse with the rise of protectionism, and as you said, the use of certain left-wing economic policies is a really toxic mix, and obviously is very reminiscent of the 1930s. The only way to combat that is to push back against that xenophobic discourse with a discourse that that points the finger at class divisions rather than these other forms of divisions. And I think another element of that, which the left has not been great, so the left has not historically been very good at acknowledging the fact that people are going to need someone to blame and delivering a kind of narrative that locates the blame for economic breakdown with elites. It has also not been very good at linking a critique of capitalism at the domestic level with a critique of imperialism globally. And I think if you look at the last 40 years of financial globalization, so particularly that issue of capital being incredibly mobile, whilst people are not mobile, that has been the source of massive inequalities that have emerged since the 1980s, and particularly spatial inequalities. Because where you have highly mobile capital and people aren't very mobile, capital tends to agglomerate in areas where it already exists, right? Which is why you've had, the UK is now the most unequal country in Europe, but everywhere in the rich world, there is an increasing disparity between cities that are heavily integrated into the global economy and rural areas that have an investment sucked out of them. And into kind of financial and often property markets in the capital. And we have not developed a critique of financial globalization. It's been easy to develop a critique of capitalism, relatively speaking. It has not been that easy to say, we need to restrict the ability of money to move around the world. We need to develop new international institutions that are not premised upon American imperial power and do not rely on the kind of institutionalization of austerity as a way of projecting that power. That's, I think, the next step for many left movements to be able to take, and it's why the debate around Europe has evolved in the way it has in the UK, because there are these critiques of the European Union, particularly that reliance upon capital mobility. That many people think that we need to push back against, and whether that involves kind of attempting to reform the institution from within or building new sets of institutions is still an open question, but it is something that we need to be thinking about much more clearly.
So, goodness gracious, you really
in the back there,
Yeah. So in the past decades, we've seen several models and attempts in Latin America to build some other kind of system. We've seen it in Brazil, we saw it in Venezuela, we saw it in Bolivia more recently, and we've seen attempts all the time to take that back with coups, with all types of very reactive politics. What kinds of lessons does that give us when we're trying to build a movement from below? If we see that kind of almost systematic defeat that we see at the moment, and I think Bolivia is the most recent tragedy.
The reason that democratic socialism in the global north is so important at this moment in time is not that obviously the rich world is the place in which working people are the most exploited, because that's transparently not true. I mean, the kind of capitalism we have today relies on hyper-exploitation of workers in the global south to provide a slightly elevated standard of living for workers in the global north. And imperialism is a central part of that. So the reason, that it is so important to generate kind of proper socialist movements in the global north is primarily, as well as, those states having the capacity to quite drastically shift the rules of the international economy, is to actually get out of the way of movements in the global south, which are generally kind of generated by that class of hyper-exploited labour, and allow for the organic development of socialist parties and movements in those places, rather than what we've seen over the last 40 years, which is ongoing imperialism of various different kinds to prevent that hyper-exploited labour force in the global south from being able to take control of states in those countries and kind of pursue a very different model of development. That has been the case ever since the 1960s, ever since decolonization. And there has been this sense that those newly independent states might take the wrong path and start pursuing socialist approaches to development rather than capitalist ones. And that has been the solution to that was not just to project military power, which of course was a big part of it. It was actually to write a set of rules for the international economy, embed those in international institutions, and then enforce the logic of capitalism and of neoliberalism on the global south. So the way in which we kind of put down socialist movements in the global south and in Latin America is obviously partly military, and obviously, there are big questions around American involvement in what's happened recently, but they're also economic. I mean, if you look at Ecuador, Argentina, various other cases of attempted kind of, not even socialist, just like social democracy, social democratic transition, there is always the threat of capital flight or of capital strike. Now, the reason that this is so damaging in these countries in the global south is that most of them don't borrow in their own currencies and they don't have control over their own monetary policy. This is also why capital flight was, again, such a threat for Greece and for Ireland. They don't have control over their own monetary policy. And this is, I think, why we're going to see such significant resistance to socialist transformation in the US and the UK, is that these countries do have control over their own monetary policy and they do borrow in their own currency. The threat of capital flight, I mean, there is absolutely no threat that there would be capital flight from the US in the event of there being a socialist government, because they have the global reserve currency. They can just print money that is infinitely valuable until it's not. In the UK, similarly, there is a limit on the capacity of governments to borrow in the context of hostile bond markets and to create money in the context of the effect that would have on the currency. But it's not a hard, fixed limit, and it provides space to be able to borrow much more in the short term without there being that immediate visceral reaction from capital markets. And that is reinforced by the fact that we are living in an age of very low bond yields, which is likely to continue, and by the fact that central banks own a huge amount of government bonds themselves, which again limits the impact that capital markets can have on bond yields. So the lessons that come from the global south are, not necessarily that we are going to become Argentina and we will not lose access to capital markets if we pursue this stuff, or, will experience rampant inflation. It's more that the countries that have the power in the global economy are generally the ones that are also, much more in control of their own monetary policy and able to do these things much more effectively. At the same time, that puts the impetus on the US, the UK, any other country that is able to kind of develop a socialist government to facilitate, basically to create a new international economic order that would provide countries that attempted socialist transition in the global south with access to resources, technology transfer, that would rewrite tax treaties, that would set up new international development banks that would again allow these countries to access finance in the event that the bond markets did turn on them, and that would also stop doing active military imperialism to project its the interests of international capital overseas. For me, that's actually probably the most significant thing that socialist governments in the global north could do. Having said that, the dynamics of that kind of struggle within the Eurozone are particular, because it is hard to, I mean, in many ways you have the same sorts of problems as you do within Global North and Global South at the international level within the Eurozone, between the kind of core and periphery, between the north of the Eurozone and the south of the Eurozone. And obviously socialist transition in those more marginalised economies is going to continue to be contained and constrained by the fact that not only can they not borrow in their own currency, and not only can they not control their own monetary policy, but they're actually constrained by rules about how much they're able to borrow. So yeah, I mean, we will see what happens in the Eurozone, but whether it can be reformed in time to allow those countries to kind of experiment their own development paths, or whether during the next recession the disparities between those two sections of the Eurozone accelerate so much that it breaks down, I think we'll start to see that in the next couple of years. Right, so there, and then there. And also, can some women ask some questions, please? Thanks. Oh, there's one in the back. Okay, great. You go after this guy in the red t-shirt.
I just wanted to build off that question. So say if we're in a country that does have control of its money and they kind of form like a constellation of institutions, like how do they then, like, how do we develop the skill sets, like the soft skill sets to strategically direct and keep like such a constellation accountable when currently, like where that doesn't exist, that process is like embedded to like the gross mentality and measures are like done in a certain way. Like how do we even start to unpick that or get that capability?
Yeah, so that was a question about how you like maintain accountability in any of these new institutions that we might build to kind of redirect capital.
Yeah, or how do you separate that from like the kind of KPI measure growth
Yeah.
sort of like
Oh, right, and how you measure that. Yeah, so I think this speaks to the importance of organising outside of electoral politics as well as within it, because any kind of either attempt to change existing institutions or build new ones will be met with resistance that will need a movement that is able to kind of push back against that. And I think the most significant way that needs to happen is to ensure that industries that are nationalised, that public services, that sections of the economy that are insulated from the market mechanism are democratised. So to really have the transformation or the transition of the principles of political democracy into the realm of the economy. So that kind of democratisation of the economy is going to be really central to ensure that decision making in, let's say, a public banking system or in the NHS or in public services, whatever, is accountable to the vast majority of people rather than either to capital or to kind of bureaucrats or politicians. And that requires experimenting with very different models of corporate governance. In the UK, we've got a think tank called We Own It that's done a report recently looking at how you could democratically manage nationalised public services. And it's things like having elections to board members, having a model of stakeholder decision-making that incorporates unions, movements, communities, etc. We've also got the kind of emergence of this idea of community wealth building in the UK, which is about how local public institutions, so universities, local government, health sector, etc., can work together with communities to kind of embed capital within the local economy and ensure that those institutions remain accountable to those communities. This is kind of, some of you may have heard of it, it's like the idea of the Preston model, which is when, kind of local anchor institutions work together to basically, keep capital in the local economy by insourcing, by prioritising local and cooperatively owned corporations, and by engaging in models of kind of collective local decision making that again facilitate democratic accountability. I think, in terms of metrics, there's obviously that question about GDP. Is that a good measure of growth? Obviously, of growth of prosperity. It's obviously not. And I think there is definitely a role for expanding the kind of measures that we have of prosperity, but also I think the main thing is just to make sure that the things that we are prioritizing are not generated by an arbitrary set of technocratic statistics or, metrics, but are actually determined by grassroots discussion, decision-making, electoral debate, these measures to ensure that planning of whatever kind we might imagine in a socialist economy is always democratic and led by people. Guy in the red t-shirt?
Oh, yeah. It's actually a joker.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, thanks for the talk. One word that I don't recall being mentioned at any point was China. And you're talking about building a new global financial regulation system. China appears to be a state that is also very much into it's based on massive state investment on a global scale. And how do you imagine this new global financial system working with the intentions of China, and how do you think that China would fit into it? Because I think they're more powerful potentially than in the West is or will be.
Yeah, totally. So that was a question about China. I get asked this question. Yeah, I'm increasingly asked this question actually, and it's not something that I have a completely coherent answer to, because you're right. We are seeing the success of China over the last 30, 40 years has been based upon a repudiation of the logic of the Washington Consensus or the Wall Street Consensus or whatever you want to call it, which has been open up your economy, privatize state assets, cut taxes, whatever, increase the role of the market. I mean, sure, China has marketized sections of its economy, but it is still a command and control economy where the state owns the vast majority. The state still continues to own most of the means of production. The state controls the entire financial system. Credit controls exist. So, again, capital controls on the ability to move money in and out of the country exist. And it's basically broken all the rules of the neoliberal growth model to get to where it is today. The question of where it goes next is really important, because whilst that model potentially is helpful in terms of providing an alternative set of goals and priorities for development for countries in the global south, so by saying China did it, so it's okay for you to have state-owned industries, so it's okay for you to have capital controls, etc. The way that China is behaving internationally often is not, and even actually domestically, does not align with the kind of principles that we would want to promote. And I'm thinking in particular of the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative has been based upon the maintenance of pretty extractive, almost kind of neo-colonial debtor-creditor relationships between those states and China. So there's often the promise of large infrastructure projects, which are delivered, but which are paid for by the countries that those infrastructure projects are developed in debt that is issued by China in renminbi, and this is an explicit strategy to kind of internationalize the renminbi, but often which are unpayable by those governments, often much of which disappears into corrupt holes and is never found. And in response, there have been a number of occasions where, in response to an inability of a state to pay back its debts to China, China has either actively taken control of the infrastructure that it has built within that country, or kind of started to play a much more significant role in those countries' affairs. So yes, the Chinese model is interesting and definitely provides a counterweight to the logic of American imperialism. But I think that the only route forward for socialist economies is to engage with China and do so in a very strategic way, but actually build institutions build new institutions basically. And those institutions have to be based on solidarity between workers in the global north and the global south, so between socialist economies in the global north and economies in the global south that have an interest in being able to borrow money and being able to build infrastructure, but not necessarily in a way that relies on kind of those fairly extractive relationships. Yeah, there.
Thank you so much. That was a really compelling account and weirdly hopeful for these kinds of conversations that we often have. I wanted to ask about an aspect of globalization that you brought up a little bit, but I'd love to hear you talk about more, which is migration. Following a little bit off of what you just said, but also thinking about the way in which migration is invoked at the level of electoral politics, sometimes as this sort of solution to labor shortage or to having to kind of reorient the economy, whether you have an aging population or whether you have sort of a, a stagnant rate of growth, whatever. And then on the other hand, the fact that so much and an increasing amount of migration now, both so-called documented and undocumented, is as a result of people fleeing instances of climate crisis, whether it's something like cancer rates or whether it's something like overt disaster. So could you tell us a little bit more about the place of migration, the movement for open borders, and kind of these movements for solidarity between North and South, as well as inside of, for instance, an urban space that has a very segregated housing policy, for example? How does that factor in?
Yeah, so the dynamics of the movement of people at the level of the international economy are just as shaped by imperialism as the movement of capital, if not more. And whilst it is, it's always the responsibility of socialist movements to push back against xenophobia, against hatred of migrants, actually have solidarity towards migrants, to shut down border camps, to have an explicit attempt to push the conversation domestically towards greater freedom of movement, towards a much more open world. It is also our responsibility to not just think about our responsibilities to the global south in terms of migration, but actually think about them in terms of structural transformation of big institutions and of capital flows and all these sorts of things. Because obviously, just migration is not a solution to the spatial inequalities created by capitalism. We cannot, no more than we can expect everyone who lives in the Rust Belt of the US to up and leave their communities and go and live in New York. We cannot expect to solve the issues created by imperialism by expecting people to leave countries, communities that are decimated by the logic of climate change, by the logic of imperialism, and just come to the global north, often dying in the process. So this is where I think that question of those new institutions becomes really important. Because on the one hand, we need to dismantle the kind of violent border industry that exists throughout the global north, and actually obviously exists within the European Union itself as well. I mean, I think, we need to really distance ourselves from this liberal cosmopolitan narrative of free movement that limits it to white people, and which is premised upon the fact that free movement is good because I can go and have a skiing vacation in the Alps, and also people from Turkey can't come into Europe, right? So it's really important to develop a language around migration that is based on solidarity, a critique of imperialism, a critique of colonialism, a critique of empire, and an acknowledgement that the global north has caused the climate crisis, and it will be the global south that disproportionately suffers from it. But again, the reform of institutions and the dismantling or the challenging of capitalist imperialism as an economic logic is just as important. And in fact, has to take place alongside that if we are going to have, a sustainable kind of transformation of the global economy. And I think, generally, when the successes that have been achieved by governments like Bolivia's show that, there are ways of challenging the logic of imperialism and actually, alleviating the immense suffering caused by capitalist imperialism in the global north. And as I said at the beginning, one of the biggest opportunities presented by socialism in the US, the UK, other powerful economies is that they can get out of the way of those socialist movements. They can start, building new institutions like new international development banks. There's this idea of the global Green New Deal that includes a Marshall Plan for the global south. The big thing is technology transfer and the transfer of intellectual property, because the global north continues to extract economic rents by their monopolization of knowledge and of technology. And this is actually largely what the dispute between America and China is about. Particularly, the focus on Huawei, it's like, America doesn't want China to get access to technologies that underpin the prosperity and productivity of the global north. So all of that has to come into it alongside, obviously, a real challenge, not just to the kind of logic of anti-immigrant policies, but to that discourse that says the reason that you are suffering is that there are too many migrants coming over here. Because as long as that discourse is allowed to stand, the economic, the logic of class, the discourse of class, is never going to embed itself in the way that we need it to. One there. How are we doing for?
We're fine.
We're fine. Okay, cool. Yeah, one there, and yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. Wildly impressive you did it without any notes. So, your talk that you framed in the beginning, the economy currently is a little shakier than it once was. There's a current degree of upheaval that's required internally within institutions and also creating new ones that is going to inject a massive amount of change into economies and institutions in the global north. So, first question as an American and as a Brit, how much change and how resilient are these institutions to accommodate all this sort of continued strain on their ability to just operate, particularly since the way that you're going to have to go forward in terms of injecting a little more of socialist tendencies into these institutions is by reforming within them and, sort of having to cooperate with the things that already exist. So, a little bit about the resilience and ability to accommodate a lot of change.
Yeah, so can we kind of build power within institutions? Do we have to do it outside, and how will that affect the power dynamics within them? So I think this question, we have to be strategic, right? We have to at once work with the levers of power that exist at the level of, of the state, of international institutions, etc., whilst also acknowledging that it will never be possible to fully socialize the economy from within the institutions, using the tools of the master, right? And that requires a real focus on building power outside of those institutions, outside of parliament, and outside of the state. And I think, always on this, the writings of Ralph Miliband, who was the father of Ed Miliband, a socialist in the UK, who wrote about this idea of parliamentary socialism and whether or not it was possible. He was perennially pessimistic about the possibilities of parliamentary socialism and always focused very strongly on the need to build power outside of the state because, this was based on his brilliant understanding of Labour governments in the UK, what's happened to them historically when they have gained state power. And generally, unless there has been this really strong movement from below to hold them to account, they've been co-opted. Or they've attempted to do radical stuff and it's been stymied by the civil service or these powerful institutions that exist within the British state. So we do need to work within them. I'm not the type of person that thinks that it is completely impossible to change anything by using state power because for one thing, like capitalism is more reliant on the state than it ever has been before. Just removing that support would be a huge thing, but it's not enough. And we do need to build power outside parliament. And yes, that means focusing on social movements. It means focusing on building power within political parties, something that is the most challenging. I've just come back from the US. In the US, we don't actually have political parties. But we also need to, again, focus on the labour movement as well as a really important counterweight to the resistance that we're going to face within many of these institutions. Yeah?
So you said that we should take on the bankers the same way that Thatcher took on the trade unionists. However, one of the ways that Thatcher did this was by utilizing special branch in collusion with MI5 to take trade unionists off the streets, imprison them, and torture them. If you fast forward to more recent times, JP Morgan Chase gave a $1 million donation to the New York Police Department so that they can close down the Occupy movement and break the fingers of those activists. So in this context, what can activists actually do? Actual activists, not BBC journalists who are somewhat protected, but other people.
What can activists do at this moment in the context of the kind of power of the state that's going to be mobilised against them?
Yes.
That's a good question, and I think there is again, it comes down to this need to organise outside of those big institutions. I think the Occupy movement was incredible for the focus that it put on that divide between 99% and the 1%, for the way in which it allowed us to begin to generate a critique of capitalism and of the class system that hadn't been there in a while. But it wasn't the kind of mass movement that we need to be able to properly, imagine a transition towards socialism. I think, you need big institutions to big kind of agglomerations of people and of resources to be able to do that kind of extra parliamentary organising. And today the best route to develop that kind of extra parliamentary power does still seem to be within political parties, within trade unions, and within certain kind of social movements and other kind of union-based organisations. So I'm thinking particularly of debtors' unions, renters' unions, etc. The problems with that are often similar to the problems you get in trying to organise within any institution, which is that there are powers that be, and there is bureaucracy, and there is resistance. In the British trade union movement, for example, we have a number of very big trade unions, which are not particularly militant, but which have a lot of money and a lot of resources, and have a significant influence within the Labour Party. Organising within them is something that we really need to be focusing on now as well. Activists also need to be organising within their political parties to, in the UK, we obviously have this problem within the Labour Party of MPs being insufficiently accountable to their base. So the fight for what we call open selections, which is basically having MPs repeatedly selected by the party, is another thing that we need to be organising around. I think those other kind of union-based organisations are also going to be increasingly important in directly challenging the logic of financial capitalism. Renters' unions, like Acorn, for example, are really at the kind of the bleeding edge of resisting financialisation. And the housing market is going to be increasingly the source of, I think, a lot of conflict in the coming years. And you're going to see that in Germany as well, where you are starting to see the financialisation of real estate markets where you hadn't before the financial crisis, but particularly in the really heavily financialised economies in the UK, the US and Ireland. So organising in all of those different ways is obviously what activists need to do. And, I always say this, it maybe sounds a bit glib, but I think the importance of organising doesn't just come down to getting into institutions, changing them and building power. It's actually about transforming the subjectivity that is generated by finance-led growth and by capitalism, which is a highly individualised, atomistic understanding of the self, which is that we are all in constant competition with each other, and it's like gouging each other's eyeballs out to get to the top, and other people are inherently bad and all out for themselves and just self-interested. Organising, whether in a labour movement, in a party, whatever, is directly contradictory to that logic, because you're organising with other people based on a sense of solidarity that extends far beyond your understanding of yourself as an atomised individual. And breaking down that kind of really counter-revolutionary consciousness, which encourages us to see ourselves in those highly individualistic terms, is really important in and of itself. Any more questions? Yeah?
I just wanted to ask the Brexit question.
Oh yeah. Fun.
If we take it as a given that Jeremy Corbyn wins the election in December, and that the new Labour government pursues a democratic socialist model, what kind of policy should that government have in relation to the EU if we think about things like state aid rules and single market rules?
Well, if we do get Corbyn government elected, then we're going to have a second referendum, obviously, and that it will be up to a Labour government to negotiate a new deal to put to the people in that referendum. If you think about the politics of it, it's hard to see how that would be perceived as legitimate if it was something like, a customs union exit versus Remain. I think, Corbyn would have to negotiate some sort of exit from the European Union that included probably exit from the single market and the customs union, but which protected workers' rights, that attempted to kind of limit the economic impact of this, and that hopefully also protected free movement, whilst also achieving limits on state aid rules and on particularly capital rules around capital mobility. Looking over the long term, I mean, I've spoken like vocally about the problems I think exist within the European Union, and I'm pretty skeptical about the ease with which you would have, a socialist government would have in achieving socialist principles from within the EU. Having said that, the problems are much more pronounced for countries within the Eurozone than they are for those just within the single market. And I think this is going to be a real sticking point over the next couple of years, because the Eurozone is about to go into a recession, probably at some point within the next 2 years it will go into recession, and none of the problems that led up to the sovereign debt crisis have been resolved. So when you start to see growth falter, wages falter, investment fall, those problems will come front and center once again, because the central problem and the central fact of the Eurozone is the massive disparity in productivity between the northern countries and the southern countries, partly premised upon wage suppression here. And the attempt to resolve that since the sovereign debt crisis has been an attempt to institutionalize deflation across the entire Eurozone. Basically, force Southern European countries to suppress wages in order to promote competitiveness in the same way as has happened in Germany. The only sustainable way to fix that productivity disparity is through an approach of investment. It's basically a kind of Keynesian program that would invest in infrastructure, productivity, technology, etc. in those Southern European economies, financed by the Northern European economies. And that is not something that it seems that the European establishment, or indeed the most powerful countries within the EU, would ever countenance. So when you start to see this next recession, and when you start to get, again, more problems with sovereign debt, more problems with the banks in those countries that hold that sovereign debt, these questions will come alive once again. And either we will see an adaptation of the Eurozone model into a federated model with a central budget and that investment taking place, which, given the hostility of much of the German and political establishment to that, and many of the other Northern European economies to that model, doesn't seem potentially likely. Or you see the breakup of Europe into two currency zones, one for the north and one for the south. Or you see a much deeper rift, which becomes, again, it could potentially threaten the stability of the single currency as a whole. So Europe is going to change a lot. And again, the other big factor is the narrative amongst most European elites at the moment is we need, the central project of Europe is to act as a counterweight to the rising power of America and China. And this always strikes me as like a very Orwellian understanding of how the global economy works, and that if many of these people have their way, in kind of 10 years, we'll be living in this literal 1984 style scenario of three big super states where two are constantly at war and the other two are constantly at peace. So I think it's important to kind of resist that understanding of the European Union as something which is basically based on the projection of imperial power, whereby states understand that their interests and the interests of the capitals within their states are best promoted through a kind of, outward facing and imperialist Europe. So all of those challenges, like the need to deal with the problems of the Eurozone, to adapt to a changing economy, and obviously how Brexit turns out, I think will deeply transform what Europe looks like over the next 5 or 10 years. And that means that there is the potential, because of that, that instability, to shift for socialists to organise in order to shift the logic of the Eurozone and the EU more broadly to be less neoliberal. But it also means that there will be other groups that are trying to take advantage of this to deliver their vision for the Eurozone. So I think what happens in the next 5 years will be really important, and will also shape what the policies of a socialist government should be towards that newly redesigned EU. That's a question. Okay, last question. I see someone at the bar there. Yeah.
Just following on from this question, seeing as the Brexit curse has already fallen on the room, what do we do if we get Tories and Tory Brexit?
Woo. Well, yeah, I mean, if we get Tories and Tory Brexit, that is a real worry. The main reason that it is a worry is that if we get a Tory government now and it lasts for 5 years, then any hope of decarbonising by 2030 is completely out the window. And yeah, accompanied with that, the idea of a Tory Brexit and a trade deal with the US, based on provisions to privatise the NHS, put in place investor-state dispute settlements, all these horrific things that have been part of previous attempts to negotiate trade deals between Europe and America, is pretty bleak. And I think at that point, the one potentially encouraging thing that would emerge from that is that even if the Tories did win this election, they wouldn't have a majority. There's no way, really. I think it's unlikely that any party emerges from the next election with a majority, which means that it could be a government that doesn't last all the 5 years. So yeah, I know, which would be ridiculous, but there you go. That's what happens in Gramscian moments between the death of old models and the birth of new ones. Morbid symptoms. So I think the challenge then would be trying to organise to maintain the left power within the Labour Party, because that would be a strong movement to kind of try and push Corbyn out and get someone more amenable in, and also to push for another election and to start organising in all these different ways that I've suggested. But let's focus on winning. Thanks very much, everyone.